background. I went to university for English literature for approximately a year, decided about 2 weeks into it that was not what I wanted to do, and ended up at Fleming College, where I took the ecosystem management programs there. So I always have such respect for seeing all of this really cool science come together, but I wanted to say that right off the back. So my talk today obviously is not going to be on paper, and when I found out I had about 20 minutes, because I know I am now what is standing in the way between people and lunch, so I'll try and make this entertaining. But I wanted to really capture what it is that we're doing at the Nature Conservancy in Canada, and we have far too many things going on for me to adequately talk about all of them. So I thought I would talk about as many as I could with not a lot of detail, which will hopefully help to generate some questions, and then we can talk a little more about it further as we go on. But actually, I always like to start some of these presentations by acknowledging my journey that got me to the A2A region specifically. So as Gary mentioned first thing this morning, I grew up in a town called Rotherham in South Yorkshire, which is in the north of England. And it's lovely. Look at it. It was actually just voted as the unhappiest place to live in the UK. I grew up on a street that had one tree on it. That tree then got cut down, and then there was no trees at all. So I really had no idea what a landscape corridor was. The outside was not a safe place for me to go in. My mum and dad did not want me playing outside very much as a child, and it really wasn't until I moved to Canada, and specifically to the A2A region, that I really got to experience what that is like. So this is, on the right here, is a picture of me and one of the Nature Conservancy of Canada properties in South Frontenac. And it represented sort of the first time that I was able to stand somewhere and not see something else that was made by a human. And so that's something that's just really stuck with me. And I think sometimes if you sort of grow up in these environments, I'm very jealous that you got to grow up in such an amazing place like this. But just to know that not to take it for granted because you have it around you. So that's something that I always try to think about as I am trying to do the work that I do here in the Frontenac Arch. I know that the Nature Conservancy of Canada is familiar to quite a lot of you, but I don't want to assume that you all know what we do. We are the country's largest land conservation organisation. We're a charity. We work from coast to coast to coast, projects all across the country. This is a bit of an outdated map, but as you can see, it is starting to grow. And the stat that we always talk about is that with the help of our partners in the last 60 years, we have helped to conserve more than 15 million hectares of ecologically significant land across Canada. And I was going around saying that statistic for years and not actually realizing that I don't know what that means. What does 15 million hectares mean? I have no idea. So I talked to our fantastic communications department, who always have a knack of making it understandable. And I had mentioned that actually I had just gone to my first NHL hockey game at the time. And so I asked Andrew Holland, who works in our communications, and he told me that if every day for the last 60 years since NCC has been an organisation, we conserved 4,400 NHL-sized hockey rinks every day, that's the amount of land that it is. And that's a statistic that I still can't actually visualise how much that is, but the fact that I know that I can't visualise that much means that it must be a lot. And so there are a lot of pictures of my face up on the screen here, but I think they show me at my best, which is when I'm doing my job. I'm very biased. I honestly think that I have the best job in the world, so I have to thank Gary for hiring me twice so I can do it. If we haven't yet crossed paths, I'm Quinn. I'm the coordinator of conservation biology for Eastern Ontario with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And what that means is I have the privilege of getting to run our stewardship program. So everything from when a property is acquired, going out and doing the baseline inventory to see what is on there, whether that's invasive species, species at risk. I get to hike and maintain the trails, put up signage, fixing fences, removing invasive species. Every single day of my job is different, and I absolutely love it. But it does also give me a great sort of sense of what's going on in all different aspects of conservation work that is done across specifically the Frontenac Arch, but also the A2A region larger in general as well. And lots of land. I'm of course only one person, so I'm not doing it alone. I have a fantastic team that I work with, including the assistant conservation biologist, Ali Boulanger, who is here today, and Carolyn Katona, who is our development officer, senior development officer. So if you can track one or many of us down, and also Gary probably has more knowledge in his head and has forgotten it than I will ever learn about this region. So happy again, as I mentioned at the beginning, to chat a little bit further about the work that we're doing here. As mentioned a bit before, I'm also involved in environmental and youth spaces and a lot of other aspects in my life. And I think this is relevant because it speaks to a lot of the connections that are able to be made. So I sit on the Young Professionals Committee of the CCIUCN, and I'm also a United Nations Association in Canada Sustainable Development Goal Impact Mentor, which is a very long title, but essentially what it means is that I get to work with youth, typically kind of ages 14 to 21, who are working on projects in their own communities about the Sustainable Development Goals. Everything from doing autism awareness campaigns to greening their schoolyards. It has been so humbling to see the incredible projects that they are putting together at 14 years old. When I was 14, I was not thinking about what I could be doing to save the planet. So it's given me a lot of hope for all this fantastic work that is happening out there. Because it not only allows me to get that intergenerational help, we talk a lot about intergenerational partnerships, working with youth and connecting youth with people who are working in the field, but youth have a lot to share with other youth as well. So I think that's an important aspect that sometimes gets missed from this conversation. So I encourage you all, as you think about the work you're doing in the region, how are you engaging youth in the work that you do? And how are you making sure that youth in your areas are able to connect with each other as well? Some of my highlights from times in these programs, I co-led a session at the Global Youth Summit, I spoke at the Women's Forest Congress in Minneapolis, and most recently I moderated the keynote address at the UN's Generation SDG Symposium. So I've got to do a lot of cool things and have a lot of fun with it as well. And I promise I'm not just saying that to brag. My goal here is to sort of think about this in a different way. So when I was first starting in this conservation space, I was super focused on fieldwork, which was fantastic, and I still is my first love. But certainly I have learned that all of these different aspects, especially the Sustainable Development Goals, all go into making this work possible. And then of course, this past December, I had the incredible opportunity to represent the Nature Conservancy of Canada at COP15. Feels a bit surreal, honestly, the idea that I attended COP15 as a delegate. It really started out with me one day daydreaming in my office after having a conversation with Dawn, and then turned into helping to pitch and then attend as one of the only youth delegations that was solely youth focused that went to COP15 in Canada. So lots of incredible ways to connect both with my peers, and media was also a big part of this as well. I think when we have events like COP15, it becomes very hard to actually quantify what happened. I spoke to many people both in the conservation community and outside that didn't really have any idea what was going on. So part of what I was able to do there was doing media, print, radio, TV interviews about some of the things that were actually happening and making it relevant. And I think the biggest thing that came out of COP15 for me, and I'm going to be breaking it down a little bit later, is just the idea that, you know, we have this fantastic framework now, but it's just a piece of paper. And what was actually decided in Montreal is actually what is going to be implemented by us, and us being the people here in this room who are on the ground doing the work. And I don't think it was until I was there that I really made that connection of we all actually do have a part and a role to play in this, which I do find really inspiring, especially coming out of an event that could certainly be a bit overwhelming and a bit like, oh, it's just another bureaucratic piece of paper that's not actually going to mean something. But all of this did cause me to go back and reflect on the work that I am doing at the Nature Conservancy of Canada and how it all actually ties in to what was decided in Montreal. So this map has been put up a couple of times. I know it's not a surprise for some of you. So over 20 years, we've been working in the Frontenac Arch portion of the A2A region. Currently manage over 2,700 hectares of land and have assisted with a further 3,000 hectares. I didn't ask how many hockey rinks that is, but I'm sure we could figure it out somehow. And I'm sure you all agree it would be lovely if we could protect every single piece in here. Unfortunately, not super financially feasible. But what makes it possible for us to do this in a way that kind of, I guess, makes sense is through our planning process. So we have our natural area conservation plan process that I'm going to go into a little bit to help us make this a bit more manageable. And I just wanted to highlight the corridor that we have there on the right-hand side, just east of Frontenac Provincial Park. And it goes to show the help of our partnerships. So the darker green are those NCC owned and managed lands, the lighter green being conservation lands, and the ones up at the top there are Queen's University lands. So it's amazing the partnerships we've been able to have. If you just look at this map and didn't put those partner lands on there, they would look like floating blobs in the middle of nothing. It's not until you actually put all that partnership together that you're able to see the impact that we've been able to have. So I like this graph because I like to call it the Gary Bell Mountain Range. You can tell when Gary started at NCC because suddenly it has skyrocketed. But it shows kind of the exponential protection that the Nature Conservancy of Canada has been able to do in the region. And yeah, so a question I get asked a lot, especially when I talk to international audiences sometimes as well, is how do you prioritize it? I think we don't often think about just how much land there is in Canada and these really large numbers that we're working with. And the answer to how we do that is through NACPs. So NACPs, or Natural Area Conservation Plans, are ways that the Nature Conservancy of Canada prioritizes on a landscape level where we're going to do our work. And we figure out what that means based on biodiversity, opportunity, and threat. So in Eastern Ontario, it's a little bit blurry, but you can kind of see on the right-hand side there, we have two active NACPs. So that is the Ottawa Valley and the Frontenac Arch. And what an NACP does, it refines the assessment of biodiversity targets that are identified in conservation blueprints and establishes a long-term vision. So these plans run for 10 years and they include lots of actions about things that are going to get done, things like we want to investigate American ginseng and see how that's doing as a population. We want to make sure that on a landscape level we're controlling Phragmites. We want to make sure we're maintaining our partnerships and removing buckthorn and all these actions that go into building this plan. But a big part of it is also the securement prioritization and what lands are NCC going to look to secure and protect, and where are we going to put our priorities. So this just helps us focus it down a little bit more. Unfortunately, my program director, Rob McRae, is unable to be here today, but he would like me to speak to a little bit of what NCC plans to do moving forward. We've already had such great success, but we want to make sure that we are capitalizing it and doing the work that we need to. As an organization, NCC has committed to doubling the pace of conservation, which is exciting because then I get more areas to play in. But certainly there are some areas that we would like to focus in. So the first is building on the great work that has already been done in the western part of the subregion. Over on the left-hand side there, we like to refer to this as kind of a Liberal Wilderness block and adjacent. Really working there with lots of continuous habitat, trying to link those pieces together. And then the second priority is starting to look a little bit further east in the subregion. Rob has plans to restore and enhance habitat at the A2A pinch point. And as we move into these new areas, you'll see there's a fair amount of white there on that map that needs to be filled in. We will be looking to our partners and friends to collaborate to help make this a reality. And so as I mentioned, one of the products that comes out of an NACP is that securement prioritization map. And I don't have time to get into the details of sort of how this all came together. I could probably do an entire presentation on it, but to put it simply, what we do is we work with our GIS department to identify, kind of on a parcel by parcel level, as you can see up there, where should we focus our priorities? So of course, this output is only as good as the data we're able to input in it. And so we use a variety of sources to figure out where we have areas that have the highest ecological need and what are facing the highest risks. And depending on how you fine-tune this, you could come out with hundreds and hundreds of parcels, which may not actually necessarily help you to narrow it down. So it's an ongoing process to kind of getting that balance right. But it does give us the ability to use this data to sort of see where we have those landscape corridors and where we can figure out on sort of a cost-based approach where we should focus our efforts. And so this is something that we want to invite the rest of our conservation community and friends to help us with, right? If you are working on developing plans and trying to figure out where you should be putting your efforts, I think we should work together to do that. So we have this great data set that's constantly evolving. This Frontenac Arch Conservation Plan was done in 2018. It was one of the first things I did when I came back into this role. And so we're about halfway through that cycle, and we've already seen kind of priorities changes and things shifting really quickly as we try and move. But if anyone actually in the room is interested in exploring the idea further, I highly encourage you to reach out to me or my program director, Rob McRae. We're always looking to figure out where NCC can have that impact and who we can help as we do our work. And I always think it's a good idea to fill these presentations with just really nice pictures, especially the beautiful A2A region on a day like today when we're all stuck inside and probably wish that we could be out exploring some of these areas. So in the spirit of connectivity and COP15 and sort of trying to wrap this up all together for you, I wanted to close by touching on some of the lessons that I learned from COP15 and how I and the rest of the team are implementing those into the work that we do in Eastern Ontario, specifically with stewardship. So as Dawn touched on this morning, I left COP15 with an overwhelming sense of optimism, and I honestly didn't expect to. I thought I would get there and it would be sort of the crushing reality of dealing with this bureaucratic big system. But really what I took away from it is that from every corner of the world, from multiple industries, different diverse perspectives, everybody had a little piece to add to the conversation. And when you added up all those little pieces together, a lot of it was that, we're all dealing with the same issues and we're all perhaps on different scales and perhaps coming from different sources. But the idea that we all want to work together towards this, and lots of fantastic dialogue coming from places that perhaps I didn't expect it to come from, like the private industry. So that was really enlightening to see. So if you actually haven't had a chance to read through the Global Biodiversity Framework, I highly recommend it. So I'm going to touch on 3 of the targets today and how I've incorporated them into the work that I am doing. But of course, the Nature Conservancy of Canada works beyond these 3 on many of the other targets, which you can read about. So I won't ask you to read all the text, I just copied it up there, but Target 4 essentially talks about species at risk. So species at risk protection has always been a big part of our work, especially given the high concentration of species that we see in the Frontenac Arch. And it's also been a place where collaboration has been so important for our success, whether it's collaborating with researchers from Queen's University who are accessing NCC lands or conducting our own species at risk surveys. It's not something we've been able to do alone, and especially when we have different organizations all trying to do the same thing, it makes a lot more sense for us to do it together. And so the biggest example, and the one that I think I'm the most proud of, is a partnership that we did with Ontario Nature to look at American ginseng. So I've just wrapped up the project, and I think this is the closest to playing science that I got to get, because I got to contribute to an actual research paper, which was kind of cool. It was led by our dear friend and recently deceased Kathy Keddy, looking at different population dynamics of American ginseng across the region. And so this collaboration with Ontario Nature allowed us as an organization to look beyond just NCC lands and be able to kind of offer up NCC lands as a way to help us find out what's happening with American ginseng populations, and specifically population dynamics. So we did a herbivory study, testing different control methods to try and find out if there's anything we could do to stop herbivory, both from mammals, but also slugs as well, and different diseases and pathogens. And then also we did a Head Start study, so looking at if there's different ways we could stratify seeds to try and encourage success. And so I don't have any specific examples I can share from this study yet. We're still kind of all wrapping everything up. But just an example of how I had shifted my thinking about how to work collaboratively in order to reach one of the COP15 targets. And then target 6 is about invasive species. So a large majority of the stewardship work that we do in Eastern Ontario is on invasive species removal. I get to spend a lot of my day dressed up like a Ghostbuster, trying to get rid of invasive species. Everything from volunteer garlic mustard removal days where we get the community involved to chemical and manual control work that we have long-standing on dog strangling vine, buckthorn, Japanese knotweed, things that are threatening our priority areas. So we've always taken a landscape approach to this type of thinking. And so this has only compounded when we turned our attention to Phragmites control. I'm sure you're all aware the prevalence of invasive Phragmites australis in our wetlands, roadsides and riparian areas is a threat to the biodiversity in the A2A region, and it's something that we've just seen explode over the last few years. Manual control of this species is time consuming and doesn't always have the best results. So with the recent approval of Habitat Aqua, which is a herbicide created for overwater application and treatment of Phragmites, Eastern Ontario embarked on a concentrated control effort in 2022. It was kind of unlike anything that we tried to do here in the region. So we selected 8 sites on NCC properties in Eastern Ontario where we saw high levels of Phragmites threat. And although NCC has had significant success with Phragmites control programs in southwestern Ontario, we have some great examples from Point Pelee of sort of working on this landscape level control method. It was a first for us in Eastern Ontario, so looking at how we could really broaden our understanding. So we weren't just treating these tiny populations on NCC properties. How can we work with our neighbours? How can we work with the municipalities to try and figure out how we can do this on a bigger scale? So, and it ended up being a very collaborative approach. So of the 8 populations that we did as a bit of a test pilot study, some of the control was completed by NCC staff, some was completed by volunteers, both through volunteer placement programs. We were lucky to get some CCC and Ocean Bridge technicians last year who spent many long hours killing frag. And also some volunteer events. So we hosted a partnership program with Number 9 Gardens and did some Phragmites control on our Hawk Ridge property. And so there was a lot of external collaboration, in many, probably about 50% of the Phragmites populations that we looked at extended onto neighbours' property. And especially when we're trying to do something a bit more involved, like doing chemical control, that obviously we need to get some buy-in and we need to make sure that our neighbours are okay with this and comfortable. So that required a bit of legwork, especially in advance. And especially when we were working with something like Habitat Aqua, we were the first in Eastern Ontario to apply and be successful for that permit. So it was sort of uncharted territory of, are we going to get this permit? Are we going to be able to do it? What sites make the most sense? And it was a collaborative and individual approach in the sense that not every site was suitable for chemical control, not every site was suitable for manual control. It really took all of these coming together to make it happen. So we have seen some great success in the sites that we piloted in 2022 and looking forward to extending that in 2023. So I sort of leave that as a teaser of if you are also trying to do Phragmites work within your organisation, we would love to chat and partner with you on that as well. And then Target 22 is actually my favourite one. I think the power of amplifying underrepresented voices was a highlight of my time at COP15. Because I truly believe in my heart that we will be a stronger, more resilient group when we have equitable, inclusive and effective access to our A2A areas. And I think we need to embody that in the A2A region, and I think we're off to a good start. That's including the participation of Indigenous peoples, youth, women. I think if we look around in the room, think of who's not here, as well as thinking of who is here and celebrating those people as well. And just as nations came together in Montreal, we are coming together now in this room with different perspectives, different resources, but also the passion to help make that connectivity a reality. So I think, if I had to sum up my one takeaway from COP15, it really has changed how I think of the work that I do in Eastern Ontario. It used to be very insular, I would think about what I was doing in my day and what needed to be done in my field plan. And although it's a lot more work to broaden my horizons of saying, what's happening outside of the NCC property boundary, I think in the end it will make us both a stronger organisation and a better neighbour and better friend as well. So I know that was a whirlwind and sort of a bit of a different approach to this topic as opposed to just telling you a scientific study. But my goal, as I mentioned, was to hopefully spark further conversation, and happy to try and answer any questions that you might have, and also put you in touch with the rest of my team if need be. But thank you so much for giving me the space to do this. I love talking about the work that I do, and I love working here.
All right, so hi everyone, my name is Sasha Huybregts. As David mentioned, I am the Madawaska Highlands Conservation Coordinator at CPAWS, which is the Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society, and I'm working at the Ottawa Valley chapter, and I'm going to tell you guys about one of our more recent campaigns, which is protecting the Madawaska Highlands, which we believe is one of the last remaining opportunities for protection and connectivity in southeastern Ontario. Before I begin my presentation, I just would like to take a moment to recognize that the Madawaska Highlands lie on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, and our goal throughout this campaign, as well as all our other campaigns, is to engage and collaborate with Indigenous communities to ensure their priorities are upheld. So I'm just going to give a brief overview of the presentation before I begin. I'm going to start off by telling everyone a bit about CPAWS and what we do, and then I'm going to move on to some background information on the Madawaska Highlands, and then move on to the conservation value and potential of the region, as well as the current threats that the region is currently facing, and then our objectives for the campaign, and then what we have done and are currently doing for the campaign. And then I also want to briefly talk about applying the A2A lens to our specific project in the Madawaska. And then finally, to wrap up, I want to just mention a few other CPAWS initiatives that are happening in the A2A region. So to start off, CPAWS are dedicated to the protection of public land, freshwater, and ocean with a strong national and regional presence across the country. So we have chapters in pretty much every province. Our chapter, the Ottawa Valley chapter, is dedicated to protecting public and fresh water across the Ottawa River watershed to sustain nature and people for future and current generations. And our main goal is to conserve nature to respond to the dual crises of accelerated biodiversity loss and climate change. And we also take special consideration to work in a way that respects the sovereignty and leadership of Indigenous nations. So this is a map of the Madawaska Highlands. It's located in southeastern Ontario, pretty near Algonquin Park. It comprises about 2,100 kilometers squared of land, 70% of which is Crown land or public land, which is what our organization focuses on. And there are currently 3 provincial parks in the region. There's the Lower Madawaska River Provincial Park, Centennial Lake Provincial Park, and Madawaska Provincial Park. And then there's also 3 ANCIs, or areas of natural and scientific interest. However, these protected areas take up less than 5% of the Madawaska Highlands that are currently protected. And as you can see from this map, these protected areas are pretty small and isolated from one another. So one of our main goals is to also increase the connectivity within the Madawaska Highlands. So the Madawaska Highlands are one of the last remaining wild spaces in eastern Ontario, and it has many conservation values, including rich biodiversity, and it's home to at least 42 species at risk. The landscape is mostly made up of wetlands, lakes, rivers, and forests, including many old-growth forests. The Madawaska Highlands also contribute to connectivity and ecological corridors, which has been a main focus of today's symposium. And then it also provides important ecosystem services such as flood mitigation. Compared to other regions in the A2A, it is relatively intact and unfragmented, but we are really trying to be proactive and protect this area before it becomes fragmented. So we're really trying to be proactive in this campaign and prevent any kind of fragmentation. And I also just want to mention that all these pictures were taken in Lower Madawaska River Provincial Park on one of our youth canoe trips, and they were all taken with one of our drones. So just wanted to mention that as well. These are a few of the species at risk in the Madawaska Highlands. You can find most of these pretty much throughout the A2A region. These are just a few examples of the many species at risk that are found within the Madawaska Highlands. So I want to touch on connectivity because that is one of our main focuses as well with preserving the Madawaska Highlands. Most of you have probably seen this map already. It's of the A2A region, and the Madawaska Highlands are highlighted there in that yellow box, and it fits right into the A2A corridor, and we believe it's vital to protect the Madawaska Highlands before it becomes fragmented and more disturbed. And as I mentioned before, compared to other areas, it is relatively intact. But one reason that we want to protect it proactively is that it's much easier to preserve existing ecological integrity than it is to regain it after it's been lost. And in addition to A2A, the Madawaska Highlands supports overall connectivity in Ontario, which is currently very fragmented. In addition to more traditional conservation values, the Madawaska Highlands also has many societal, cultural, and economic values. Creating protected area offers the opportunity for recreation, including camping, hiking, canoeing, hunting, and fishing, which provides opportunities for diversifying the economy through ecotourism and park activities. And it also increases Canadians' appreciation and connection to nature, especially because the Madawaska Highlands are pretty close to the city of Ottawa, so it offers people living in the city to get outside and appreciate nature. Okay. The Madawaska Highlands also provides nature-based solutions to global issues such as climate change and human health, as do all protected areas. The Madawaska Highlands is home to many mature forests and wetlands, which sequester large amounts of carbon, provide clean air and water, and provide flood protection. However, I did mention that the Madawaska Highlands are relatively intact. However, they do face many threats, which is why we are trying to protect it. There are industry pressures and resource extraction activities in the region, including logging and mining. And then we also have the continual increase in population, especially in the city of Ottawa, which is continuing to expand. And because it is relatively close to the city of Ottawa, we do have that concern that if it continues to expand, that it will threaten these regions that are close to the city. And as well, the protected areas within the Madawaska are too few and too small to have significant ecological viability and connectivity. So what are our goals with this project? We want to protect at least 30% of the Madawaska Highlands. This number comes from trying to create a protected area that is ecologically viable. And not just because of the 30 by 30 targets. We think it's a good starting point to protect the Madawaska Highlands, but ideally we want to protect as much as possible. But it would also help us reach our 30 by 30 targets. In addition to the protecting 30%, we want to make sure that the Government of Ontario implements other conservation measures and sustainable land use planning for the remainder of the public land, and that they work with Indigenous communities to ensure proper access is maintained and priorities are upheld. We know that historically Indigenous priorities have not been upheld in certain protected areas, especially their access to hunting and fishing. And then we want to make sure that the government works with local communities to ensure that these communities are experiencing the economic benefits of a protected area in the region. So what we are currently doing is gathering information and data to create a strong case for conservation in the area. I've been writing a report summarizing this information to present to policymakers and stakeholders. I've also been using GIS mapping and spatial analysis to determine the best areas for protection. And then planning for fieldwork and citizen science activities in the region to fill in data gaps, as well as increasing outreach and education on the campaign in the Madawaska Highlands to increase support for the protection of the region. And lastly, completing a stakeholder analysis and engagement to gauge support for campaign and potential for collaboration. We should be starting that phase of the project shortly. So when I say filling in the data gaps, we would like to plan some field work for the summer, but as many not-for-profits, we are limited in our capacity. So we have plans to do citizen science BioBlitz, including species surveys and collecting tree data. And this is a good way to involve your community in conservation, as well as collecting the necessary data you need for the project. So we would like to, this is a good way to achieve both community outreach and education, as well as data collection. And then in addition to gathering new data, I also want to verify some of the current data we already have, because it is, some of it is outdated and needs to be verified. And then lastly, data sharing. So partnering with other organizations, as well as involving community members and field naturalists. And this is not just sharing your typical data. We also are trying to get community members to share photos and personal experiences and other types of less traditional data, because we think this is very valuable as well. So some of the outreach and education that we've done on the project, we've created information on our website, blogs, pamphlets, newsletters, and social media. We also did CWSP, which stands for Canadian Wilderness Stewardship Program, which is our youth education program. And as I mentioned, we did a canoe trip on the Madawaska River, and I got the chance to tell these youth about the campaign and about CPAWS and conservation in general. And then last month we also did a CPAWS Cafe on the campaign, and this was basically like a Zoom webinar to all of our supporters. And I was able to, similar to what I'm doing today, share information about our campaign. And then we also have plans to do organized hikes in the region to further increase, outreach and interest in the area. So this is the A2A lens that was developed for conservation action planning. And I have been trying to apply these principles to the Madawaska Highlands project. Some of you may already be familiar with this. 5 different principles were developed, including a landscape scale context, cores and corridors, strategic stewardship and partnerships, anticipating future threats, and then ways of knowing local and cultural knowledge. So so far, because we're still in the early stages of the project, I've been mostly focused on the scientific side of it, so identifying cores and corridors and doing that landscape scale analysis. So to identify core areas in the Madawaska Highlands, I used Canadian Wildlife Services, so the Government of Canada mapping analysis for high-value forest, wetlands, and biodiversity areas. So these are shapefiles in GIS. And then also using the Government of Ontario Forest Resource Inventory data on tree age and species. And then I combine that with using aerial imagery to determine if those forests were still standing, because as I mentioned, some of our data is outdated. So this is a good way to verify that data without actually having to go out in the field and see for yourself. So I was able to get like a rough estimate of where the old growth forests are in the Madawaska Highlands, because that data is severely lacking in this region. And then I also used Ontario NHIC, which is the Natural Heritage Information Center data for provincially tracked species, plant communities, and wildlife concentration areas, specifically looking at species at risk. So I'm using these 3 different things and seeing where they overlap to try to get a good estimate of where our priorities should be in terms of which areas to protect. And then just a few of our next steps. Once we have a more clear idea on which areas we want to protect, we want to put significant effort into Indigenous engagement. And our rough timeline for that is starting next month till September. And then we also have plans to do a stakeholder analysis and engagement. So that is talking with stakeholders and seeing how we can support stakeholders' interests while making sure we achieve our conservation goals at the same time. And then, as I mentioned, we want to do citizen science events and data collection this summer in the region. And then just to close off, I want to mention some other CPAWS initiatives that are going on in the region. So one of our other new campaigns is called Closing the Gap. This gap refers to the 18 kilometers separating Algonquin Park to the Des Moines River protected area. Des Moines River is another one of our areas that we focus on, that we've worked to create a protected area in the Des Moines River. And then we also have the Greenbelt in Ottawa, which has experienced a lot of fragmentation and roads and is overused. And there's many invasive species as well. So we have a campaign on that and a petition to try and get that protected. And then there's a 7,700-year-old wetland in the Greenbelt, Mer Bleue, which is one of the, just makes it much more important to protect the Ottawa Greenbelt. And then lastly, we have the working to maintain ecological integrity in Algonquin Park through strengthening protection and mitigating the impacts of Highway 60.
So conservation action planning, I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Some of you, our Nature Conservancy friends, for example, have used it extensively. But to highlight a couple of parts, it's an approach to developing conservation actions that's used around the world. And in Ontario, it's used extensively in Carolinian Canada Zone. There's like 22 of them the Nature Conservancy have used. But I'm just going to point out a couple of things about it. It's an iterative process. It's a process that involves partnerships, and it involves people getting together and deciding what's important for those particular areas. And it's not a one-size-fits-all at all. You don't have to do, you can do bits and pieces. Sasha talked about using the A2A lens in their work, but that's not a conservation action thing. So look up conservation action planning if you don't know what it is, and check it out. So what we did is, the idea is to promote in local planning the inclusion of ecological linkages and landscape connectivity. We did it in 2 phases. We looked at the whole A2A corridor and said, okay, if you're going to do a local conservation action, what sorts of things should you think about that broadens that local action to a more regional ecological connectivity initiative? So it wasn't a conservation action plan, but if you're going to do your own conservation action planning, what should you think about first if you're looking at regional corridors? That's where the lens came from. I'll show you that in a minute. And then we said, well, let's apply one. Let's do a conservation action plan in a local area using the system in the format. And we used the Frontenac Arch Biosphere area. So that's interesting. Sasha talked about Madawaska Highlands, which we love at the A2A. We haven't done a lot of work up there because it is a very large connected ecosystem. You move down towards the St. Lawrence River, you're into fragmentation, you're into rural resource types of areas. No, I'm not going to talk about that one. So our first phase, we developed the lens, we did some gap. First thing we started, and students here at Queen's did it, they went and looked at all the planning documents within the A2A on the Canadian side, because I will mention that the Trillium Foundation funded the work, both stages of our work. So we cheated. Lots of the US folks came up and it was a learning experience, but the actual work was on the Canadian side. So they looked at all the various planning documents, and not surprisingly, it could protect core areas, connectivity not so much. So we used a collaborative model and we developed an A2A framework. So from an engagement perspective in the first phase, so we reached out to the US side and the Canadian side. We held a couple of workshops on developing a lens. We held a webinar. We had some follow-up discussions and a couple of engagement workshops. Again, just trying to get people to think more broadly if you're doing conservation action planning. And again, Shasta showed you this. This is really one of the primary results of of that broader discussion. So the 5 principles: landscape, scale, context, again, recognizing the importance of the regional landscape perspective, the nuts and bolts of it, identifying cores and corridors, strategic stewardship and partnerships. We talked to people a fair bit, and what came out of this stage is that, when you're doing your local stewardship in Leeds and Grenville, for example, are you looking outside of your own boundaries for your own stewardship councils to connect those stream corridor stewardship programs or those reforestation programs? Take a step back, because we talked a lot about, if 6 of one, half does a dozen of the other. If you're trying to decide a priority, one of them's a bit isolated in your area, by all means, important to the local, protect it. But if the other one connects to a broader ecological picture, maybe that scores at some points in terms of priority actions. So strategic partnerships, anticipate future threats. So we talked a fair bit at this larger landscape level. How do you do that when you're doing conservation action planning in an area like the A2A? And the last science symposium in 2019, if you came to it, our final panel discussion were about research priorities. And the priority of being able to identify and anticipate the impact of future changes is critical. It's critical to message about corridor protection. When people ask me, well, why are we worried about corridors? You talk about the science and all this kind of stuff. And then you start talking about climate change. And that starts to connect with them. Oh yeah, things are moving. Then they have to have a place to move. So at that level, but the science and the research about that is not at the same level as diversity, forest interior research, all that kind of stuff. And then the final one was different ways of knowing. And we spent a fair bit of time in the first phase talking about that. I had a presentation to the Eastern Ontario Indigenous Working Group on the environment. I went through the nice little diagram for CAP, and they're looking at me and they're going, we don't think that way. We think the way on the right. It's similar. The medicine circle, all that kind of stuff kind of looks like CAP diagrams. And there's been whole CAP projects in Australia that have basically taken the CAP language and translated it into Indigenous language, and projects led by Indigenous folks. So we had a great session out at the Opinacon, for example. These are some shots from some of that first step of engagement. Larry McDermott led our Indigenous one at the Opinacon. And a funny story, nice, beautiful outside day, circle, doing the ceremony stuff. A blue heron, great blue heron, wandered up from the river, the Opinacon, and walked around outside of the circle. It was like Larry's going, what? How does this happen? So, and again, the ways of knowing component. So we had a lot of discussions around some of that. Ceremony is critical, relationships are important. This is not new, I think, to most people here who work on these things. We did have interesting discussions around the science component as to whether you would, in a conservation action plan, you try to merge the two ways of thinking, or you keep them separate. And there were different opinions about that, of everybody around the room. And we've developed some tools. Again, you can get that from us in terms of applying the lens. So what we learned, it needs to be locally driven. Conservation action planning needs to be locally driven. Tools are important. You know, conservation action planning and the way that we approached it, we didn't spend 2 years spending a lot of money on detailed background work. We had the advantage in the next stage of working in an area where there was a fair bit of background work that had already been done. So you do need a certain amount of that. Cultural context matters. There's no one size fits all. People that were involved in this project said, well, we can't do all of that. And I said, well, you don't need to do all of that. You know, the lens and the principles of conservation action planning can be more broadly applicable. And again, the ways of knowing is critical. So this is kind of what we came up with. You've got an A2A lens. You identify that there's local interest. You have gatherings and workshops around the conservation action planning format. You come up with an action plan, and then it just keeps going around and around. You monitor, you see what works, and you use it as a resource, an ongoing resource. So then we did a conservation action plan in the Frontenac Arch area. And we cheated a little bit. We didn't do as many workshops probably as would be ideal. We had Yarmo, a fellow named Yarmo Yavala, who's done a lot of these things in Caroline, Canada area, facilitate this for us. So, you know, we held a science workshop where we brought science people together to kind of talk about, well, what do we know from a science perspective? Then we took that as a foundation to have a more broad community conservation action plan workshop. So the scientists and the experts came back, but land trusts, you know, other folks came around the room and started to talk about threats and challenges. And we held a webinar, and then we completed the CAP. So this is the area that we did it in. The first thing we did is realize that the actual boundary of the Frontenac Arch Biosphere Reserve, we had to add a little bit more on. So you look at what's a good boundary. By the way, we did this in partnership with the Frontenac Arch Biosphere folks. And you know, this is the range of people that attended our workshops. So a tremendous range in terms of government expertise, scientific expertise, academic expertise, and folks that are involved, like a lot of people here, but aren't necessarily scientists. So, you know, the science workshops looked at things like key ecological attributes and all the sciencey stuff that kind of give you a leg up when you sit to talk more broadly. So again, I'm not going to try to talk, because we've talked a lot about these sorts of things, but this is the kind of stuff that emerges when you sit down in the CAP workshops. Some of the particularly unique, not unique, but particularly important threats and challenges in the Frontenac Arch Biosphere area, and the kinds of strategies that that emerged when you start to think about these things. And a lot of this is expert advice workshops, and we'd sit down and we'd go through existing information and existing documents, and how we can improve on the connectivity. So we did use a program called Marathi. So it's a complicated piece of software. We didn't do it. Yarmo sat and did his thing. But it creates a very structured process where you look at the threats, you look at the challenges, you go through potential actions, potential strategies, and you just work through it, and you start to develop all of these kinds of diagrams, and it works really well when you're sitting in a room and you've got somebody to lead you through it, and you get, so what do you think are the main threats? How do those threats connect to challenges that you've got? How do those threats connect to some of the foundational information that you've got? And you have whole, so if you go to our reports, you see in more detail when you look at forest interior targets, you look at wetland threats, you know, you can see how this group, using the information that we had available, you know, looked at the high, medium low priorities and threats and challenges. And this is, this is the kind of thing that you end up with, but within the software or within the program, you can pull out bits and pieces depending on the actions that you want to engage in. So the next steps, once you've gone through all of that engagement and all of those workshops, is you continue to refine it as it goes forward. We are looking at incorporating some of it into state of the A2A work. What emerges from that more broadly in the A2A should we be trying to report on, and primarily explore opportunities for action. So you end up with this bit of a grab bag of potential actions that people have identified. So then you step back with the participants and you say, okay, what do you want to tackle first? It's not like a comprehensive official plan or a planning document. It's opportunistic. You know, what within the groups in the Frontenac Arch area makes sense to start working on. So we decided one of the first things that came up, and of course COVID landed right in the middle of all of this, so take that for what it's worth. But we decided an invasive action potential. Everybody was trying to work on it. It was all over, and Megan helped us out a little bit with this on some of these sessions. Everybody's kind of doing their own thing, and it's a medium to high rank threat when you look at all of the Conservation Action Plan. And it relates to multiple CAP conservation targets and goals. It's kind of, you know, it's kind of in there everywhere. So for example, under invasive aquatic and wetland species, you looked at forest, wetlands, aquatic systems, and reptiles and amphibians during the Conservation Action Plan process. You saw that the severity, irreversibility, the scope of that problem was medium to high to very high. So yeah, it jumped out at us as something. And again, you can pull out all of the different types of things that control of invasive species triggers within the Conservation Action Plan. I know you're not actually able to read all of these, but it starts to show, and the important thing here, I mean, we talk about ecological connectivity, the important thing here is strategic connectivity as well. So all of the various things that people talked about during the Conservation Action Planning and the workshops, how many of them touched on the invasive species component? So these are the sorts of things you see when you go to the report. Maintain forest extent and diversity of 65% of the Frontenac Arch. And so these are the types of goals that emerged during the Conservation Action Plan process. So this is all, these reports are all online. You'll see a link at the end of this to have a look at them. So when I looked at invasive species, I basically went through all the Conservation Action Plan and pulled out everything that intersected with invasive species. And we could use that as a start of a strategic planning exercise. So when we sat down to think about invasive species, so we held a working session with all the various people that might be involved in invasive species. We reviewed the Conservation Action Plan and the potential actions, and kind of developed a easy to, that would be really hard priority list here, but creating an invasive species working group. Everybody agreed we're not talking to each other. Common advocacy efforts, we're all kind of doing our own thing there. Education program, all the way down to creation of invasive control removal team, like a SWAT team. Which they do on the SLELO in the States does that. We're a long way from doing that here. People do it for their individual pieces of land, like our friends at the Nature Conservancy there. But all of this kind of took that Conservation Action Plan down to a more practical level. So our conclusion in our run-through of Conservation Action Planning, it's a very effective for community engagement. The people around that table and in our workshops, both the A2A ones, where we were looking at the whole thing, as well as the Frontenac Arch ones, people were very engaged. And people were getting together and talking about things. And we weren't getting hung up on, well, do we know precisely what the status of this particular species is? A lot of it was, well, this is what we know, and we're trading and sharing information. Always a work in progress. We hit spots during the Conservation Action Planning process. We just don't know that. That's an information gap. Does that mean we stop and go get that information? No, it's a parking lot, there's a placeholder there. We know what the implications of not knowing the exact answer are when we continue. Continue to refine and develop action in the FAB area. It's an ongoing resource, so it's there. As I say, COVID's kind of slowed things down a little bit there, but I know there is interest at FAB at continuing to work on it. Support and engagement, other interested groups, and again, not one size fits all. There's lessons and tools for a wide range of conservation efforts. We've talked to our folks on the US side who are interested in variations on it, maybe not using the fancy software. I mean, that was kind of fun, but it's not going to be for everybody. So there's more information online. We have both the Stage 1 report that talks about the A2A lens and provides that kind of direction at a high level for what you could do. The information on, and the Stage 2 report, so the FAB report is fairly thick, but it's lots of good information there. Invasive species session, information on that. The background links to conservation action planning. And we also had a great webinar sort of at the beginning of the process that explained conservation action planning and what we were trying to do on the A2A.
Ontario Salish, and she recently read her PhD, which was about relational ecology from an Indigenous lens. And so with Little Forest Kingston, I think that's what we're trying to do. We plant forests, but really we're building relationships. This is Maureen Buchanan. She's one of our co-founders. She's from Batchewan First Nation, Anishinaabe. And she tells us, she shared a story about her first time on the land at Highway 15, the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden here, which is the site of one of our first 3 little forests. And she said the first time that she visited the land, the language that she expected to hear was English. She would have hoped she would have heard Anishinaabe her language, but the language that she heard was the language of the spring peepers. And for her, how much that really brought home the importance of all of the languages of the land. And for me, that is a very, very important teaching and story. So, landscape. This is Bell Island in Kingston. There used to be, that was the marsh, that was a dump. But on the end of it is, it's now jointly stewarded by the Mohawk Council of Chiefs in the city of Kingston because indigenous burial ground there. But land is a contested territory. This land was stolen from Indigenous people. So I'm a settler on this land. And as we think about land, and this is High Park in Toronto, we haven't been talking about cities here because cities, we don't think about cities as part of the natural world. But cities are also part of the natural world. And most of people in Canada, in the States, now live in cities. 70% of Indigenous peoples now live in cities. So how do we start thinking about cities as part of the natural world? That's something that we like to think about. How do we get past the colonization and start kind of reconnecting to the land and seeing the land as the living being that it is? We must, the elders say, reconcile with the earth itself. This comes from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we think about when Little Forest as embodied land acknowledgements. As we plant a little forest in Kingston used to be forested. We cut down most of the forests. So how do we start bringing them back? How do we help the land remember? And how does the land help us remember? So foresting, that's a verb. Can we make forest a verb? So what percent of English is nouns versus verbs? Anybody know? Joanne, you know. Joanne is one of the co-founders. Joanne, tell us.
70% of English is nouns.
What percent of Anishinaabe is nouns versus verbs?
70% of Anishinaabe is verbs.
Is verbs. So how do we learn to be a forest? How do we bring the process back? And Barry Lopez, he's not Indigenous, but he spent much of his time with Indigenous peoples, and he shares a story of when he was up in the Arctic with the Inuit. About, at one point he met a bear. From his English perspective, met a bear, a moment in time. versus bearing, where the people from the Inuit community, what was happening before, what was happening after, where had the bear been, who had been the bear's relationships. So the bear is not a moment of time, the bear is bearing. Still trying to figure out fully what that means, but this is a favorite quote of mine from Robin Wall Kimmerer. A bay is a noun only if water is dead. When bay is a noun, it is defined by humans, trapped between its shores and contained by the word. But the word wikwegama, to be a bay, releases the water from bondage and lets it live. To be a bay holds the wonder that, for this moment, the living water has decided to shelter itself between these shores, conversing with cedar roots and a flock of baby mergansers, because it could do otherwise, become a stream or an ocean or a waterfall. Isn't that beautiful? This was my house when I moved into it 30 years ago, all asphalt and grass. This is my house about 5 years ago. Together we have been foresting. And initially I started, not knowing anything about gardening or anything about forest or anything about anything. And I did a lot of conventional stuff. But fortunately the squirrels came along and helped me. They planted 9 black walnuts, they planted lots of oaks and hickories. And so together with all of the creatures of the land, it's been foresting. So how, and this is a question we asked with Little Forest Kingston, how do we learn from intelligences other than our own? Tribal adaptation menu, they have a very good tribal adaptation kind of guidelines. The plants, animals, and other Manidug spirits are our relatives and original teachers. We have always been the younger siblings and students. Our teachers are still teaching, but we no longer acknowledge their wisdom. So the trees, how do we learn from the trees? And this is a successional, we learned in schools about how natural succession works. Well, Little Forest, we're kind of breaking that natural succession process. And here again, trees are who, and it's hard. I'm trying to switch my language. I'm trying never to use it when I refer to a tree or a plant. I still do, but I'm trying not to. They're who, they're they, bringing this other language in. So moving from an egotistical, where humans, for too long in the Western mindset, we've seen humans as being on top and in control. And how do we shift into a more earth-centric approach where humans are just one in many in a relational web? And so relational has come up today. Dawn, you brought it up this morning quite a bit. So that's how we're trying to think, relational. Robin Wall Kimmerer, and this is us, Astrid, she's our soil expert, and we're planting one of the little forests 2 years ago. And we could view them as our relatives, as kinfolk we have treated badly, and to whom we seek to make amends. So that's what we're doing with Little Forest in Kingston. We're trying to make amends, working with our kinfolk. So what might a relational tapestry for foresting, see, I can't even say the verb, look like? So sometimes rewilding is like humans are pesky, we gotta keep them out. But humans are part of the natural world. And humans have, for many eons and centuries, had a wonderful relationship with the natural world. More recently, especially with the Eurocentric worldview, it's become broken, but we have a lot of wisdom that we are learning from and we're trying to bring into the work that we're doing. So these are students from Kingston Secondary School. Joanne was a teacher librarian there, just retired. And these are grade 11 students on the left. They sat in a circle, had a teaching from Maureen, and then they went and we taught them how to plant. And then the grade 9 students, the grade 11 students then taught the grade 9 students. And this one person in particular, he was a fabulous teacher. So it was lovely to see how these young people took up this mantle of teaching. This oak savanna, we don't think of oak. We think of oak savanna as a natural ecosystem that if humans just stepped out of things, it would be fine. But oak savanna was a food forest, stewarded for 1,200 years. So how do we learn from this type of stewardship? Look at the two different definitions of savanna: a collectively cared for food forest, a paradise versus a plant community vegetation type dominated by grasses with scattered drought-resistant trees. So again, thinking about these differences. So human beings, we are meant to be a gift to the land. Each of us here is a gift to the land, and we're bringing that gift as we work towards stewarding. So what is a little forest? I haven't told you that yet, so now I'll finally tell you. Collaboration between plants, soil, organisms, land, climate, geology, and people. So it's collaborations. So look at that parking lot. This one's in France. And so Dr. Akira Miyawaki, a botanist from Japan, came up with a methodology of rapidly regenerating natural forests. And it's picked up in urban centers around the world because it's really for small sites. And you see this parking lot of 9 cars. What could it become? It is now a Miyawaki forest. This was a front approach to a temple in Japan. And look how narrow the sides of that are. Think of a hedgerow. I think of these like within cities. These narrow hedgerows becoming small ecological corridors. So this is 14 years later. This is University in Utrecht. In Netherlands, they've planted over 100 of these Miyawaki-style forests. So this was the year after planting. So you can see the natural succession on the left and the Miyawaki method on the right. You're really skipping, we're planting mid to late successional species really densely all at the same time. And there in Japan, they actually started planting it all around their factories and other places to protect against natural disasters. It's kind of like a really human-centric approach, like they're planting to protect humans. And I would like to think we're planting for all of our relations, all of our kin. So real forests made up of trees. If walking around a city, you see trees spaced a certain distance apart and one layer. This is not how trees want to grow. We're not treating trees the way that they, want to be. They're lonely. And so we're doing them as an actual forest. Here's the little forest being planted in addictions and mental health services in the fall. And this one was each little forest we plant with community. So we build community, human community around the trees and around the forest. We don't plant a little forest unless there's a human community who really wants to circle around it. And in this case, the focus really was for the mental health of the residents, because forests are so healing. Soil, we really work on the soil. In the cities, we don't have forest floor. And when you're starting to plant a forest, how do we build the forest floor? So we work a lot on, the forest preparation. We do really thick and let time do the work on the soil, organisms in the soil, and all of those little teeny plants. See, we plant them really little. And 3 seedlings per square meter. That's very tight, isn't it? That's how we plant them. And minimum width 4 meters, and any shape, as long as it matches that. And there's where I mentioned it could be hedgerow. Enclosure, if you want like a refuge, which on the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden, we have a refuge. There's some interesting data around, and we're still looking at the data. The Miyawaki method, I can't find in itself enough data, and I think here in North America it's going to be a learning experience. And in cities, learning in cities. But here is the tree growth in a biodiverse forest versus monoculture forest. And you can see the difference in the tree growth, much, much stronger tree growth in a biodiverse forest. This is another one on, biodiverse forests, actually, there's higher survival, they do better. They don't know how, they don't know why, versus humans trying to control the forest. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, though, she's like, the trees act not as individuals, but somehow as a collective. Exactly how they do this, we don't know yet. Maybe we'll never know, and that's okay. Just know that they like to be together in diversity. Leroy Littlebear says, the value of wholeness speaks to the totality of creations, the group as opposed to the individuals, the forest as opposed to the individual trees. We don't expect every tree to survive. It's going to be a forest, and the trees themselves will negotiate who will survive and what that forest community will look like in 20, 25 years. How might we focus on the potential relationships of now? So this is Josh and Nathan. They're over there in the back, two little foresters working with Kingston Frontenac Housing Corporation. We've gotten permission to plan to up to 12 affordable housing sites, and really working with another community. And they are so excited. They're so excited. They want the bees, they want the birds, they want the butterflies, they want the foxes, they want all of the creatures. And so, just the involvement and working in cities and the connections with people, I think, is something that that's really where we're focusing. This is a design for a little forest at Kingston Secondary School, which Joanne has been working on that one, but the school board is going to take us a few years to work through the process. This was the design done for the addictions and mental health services by the residents themselves. The senior center is a little forest. We're planting 3 at the senior center this year, and each of them has a theme, and so they will also become educational to help people know who the different species are that are in those forests. So 30 different species in one forest. 4 different layers: canopy, tree, understory, shrub layer. All of those layers go on at the same time. Maureen said she had never met some of the trees and shrubs that we planted in the little forest at the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden. I hadn't met some of them. We're also doing pocket forests for people's yards, and we're just going to start that this year to try and just look at this lawn in my neighborhood. And this was a public works department in the States who's doing something similar, and this is what we'd like to do. Getting those ecological corridors going in the cities and the little pockets. Jennifer Grant says, again, the question I pondered as she was looking at a site had gone from how do we fix this to what can we do to strengthen human relationships with this place? How do we strengthen human relationships? So what do our relations need? What do we want the story of this place to be from this point onwards? Private land, that got mentioned already today. The amount of private land, I don't know the numbers in Canada, I just ran across this morning. But reconciliation ecology, this definition, is the science of inventing, establishing, and maintaining new habitats to conserve species diversity in places where people live, work, or play. So how do we do that in cities? And then connect out into the corridors out in the country. So in a city, in this framework species method, we would be mostly in stage 4, where there's no remaining trees as seed sources. There are some, but not a very big diversity. So Miyawaki method is recommended in cases like that. And I like to think of each little forest as in this, like a tree island, that can then, like a mother patch, that will then over time populate the surrounding area thanks to our seed dispersers, the birds, the bats, and the squirrels, and humans. We are a keystone species. We are a seed disperser as well. This is in Brazil, and there's a study that site colonization by native species was particularly the highest sites less than 100 meters than existing native vegetation. So if we plant them and get them pretty close to each other, then the more we have, there's more chance of species the spreading. This is a very recent study about cities being a potential site for species migration. The trees can't get past Toronto. The trees can't get past the 401, and they can't do it fast enough. So we're doing species migration with our little forests. And then the theory is, one, we learn from it, and we learn which species might be ready for the countryside, but also that they become those mother patches that the creatures can begin to disperse. And this is another study, and I'm not going to go through it, but basically they're showing how plants, without those corridors, the declining biodiversity of each of those plant pockets. And so just having small connecting corridors, and even within cities, I think about it, because cities can be a hub for biodiversity. In fact, they are. Not of some of the bigger species, but many insect and bee and all kinds of species like that. So sitting, is that another verb? Nourishing all ways of being, knowing, and creating within our cities. There's a book, Sacred Civics, and I really recommend that book. But bottom right there, transform. That's what I want to work on. That's what Little Forest is working on. How do we transform our cities into places where people are really connected? So many people can't get in a car and drive out. The countryside is crucial, the natural habitats out there, but so is the city. So how do we make it possible here? And then the human health. So coming back to humans, it really does matter for humans too. That the urban microbiome rewilding hypothesis is really showing that the lack of biodiversity in our guts related to the lack of biodiversity around us. So decentering human in urban policy, how do we do that? And we have so many questions as a group that we're all just starting to work through, which is really fun. We started, Maureen said after me, Joanne, and Maureen went for a walk, let's plant 3 little forests and let's do it this year, and we did. And where we've gone is very different from where we started. We're doing much more than planting little forests now. And one of the projects is we did 4 delegations to City Council, because next to the Indigenous Food Sovereignty Garden, where there's 300 square meter little forest and a second one going in this fall, they're going to build an employment park. And we challenged them to go from shovel ready to shovel worthy, and so that conversation is going on right now. And our hope is, and I think it's a fairly good hope, that one of the outcomes of that might be ecological corridors within that park. We'll find out. And so how do we look at cities through these layers that connect out into the surrounding areas so that species potentially can cross through cities? And that's Saskatoon and Edmonton. They're already thinking that way. We're not in Kingston. So this is where thinking is going. Humans in charge to multi-species knowledge. I'm not going to read all that through because we don't have time, but they are, come visit our booth, and that it's not on the website right now, but we'll put it up there. And I don't know how to say that word, but Oringcam means thank you for listening in the language of the plants. This is Monica Gagliano, and she really is working on how to learn to communicate with plants. That's something we're working on. Who knows how to do it? And I'll end with this slide. That young fellow on the right, this is Robert McLeod. These are 3 high school students that were part of Joanne's Sweetgrass Circle at Kingston Secondary School. And they were so involved and active in helping plant those first 3 little forests. Robert has gone into McGill, just finishing 2nd year civil engineering. He started a little forest group at McGill. They were almost going to plant this year, but the bureaucracy kicked in, so I think it's next year now. But he is now the chair of Little Forest Kingston, so next generation. That's it. Thanks.
So I work for the National Park Service, the Rivers, Trails, and Conservation Assistance Program, and the A2A Coalition on the U.S. side brought myself and my colleague in to help work with them. So this is what I'm going to talk about, is what we've been doing with them for the last year, and get going. So the Rivers and Trails program, we are part of the National Park Service. We sometimes call ourselves Rivers and Trails to shorten that long word. And on the U.S. side, many people are familiar with the National Park Service's first sentence of their mission, which is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of all, of this and future generations. And then my program, which has about 70 of us around the country, comes in on the next sentence, which says that the Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. So with this federal program, and that we work to try to help, we work with community groups to help them implement the visions that they have. So A2A came to us and asked us to help with what their priorities are. So we work across the country, like I said, about 70 of us. The number fluctuates a little bit. I am actually based in Vermont currently, and another colleague who's working with A2A is in Maine. We had a New York staff person, and he retired, and we haven't replaced him. So we do a whole variety of work the street trees, and I think maybe we'll learn how to forest them as opposed to just plant trees, community gardens, create trail networks, and a push for us, and also big on I think both federal administrations right now, is large landscape conservation. We have 30 by 30 by 2030, which is trying to get more land conserved, and I believe it's similar in Canada. So what we've done since we came on board about a year ago is, and the reason for this was that the A2A has been going for a while, doing great stuff, especially on this side of the St. Lawrence, and the US side has been a little bit further behind. So that's what we focused on, to try to bring the US side up to par. And the first thing we did was to create a work plan. So this is us last summer at Wellesley State Park. On a beautiful August weekend, everybody came and sat indoors for a whole day, which was lovely, to say what are our priorities for the next year, what do we want to accomplish, and how do we go about doing it. So the first thing was to start establishing regular meetings, which sounds kind of boring, but actually helps get work done. Also to think about who could collaborate, who should be sitting at the table with us, and then find other resources. Then, more specifically, they had really two prongs, even though they're 3 bullets. One is this road ecology study, which Kate has been instrumental in getting going. And I think she talked about, well, I know she talked about it at the first panel, if you heard her. And that's looking at where critters and animals are crossing the roads and how can we try to protect them. And the second is going largely on what David was talking about, the conservation action planning that it was done in Canada, this is a small group on the New York side, so it felt a little daunting for the first year. So we said, all right, we don't even know the boundaries of the A2A. So how about we try to do some conservation mapping and get that framework going, then move into the action planning. So then the third bullet is, of course, trying to find funds to get these going. And we've got a number of grants out, and so we're going to keep moving on that. So how we operate is that we join the group and try to become part of them. Not to say that, we're the experts or anything. Well, I mean, we have experience, and we have both years of working for ourselves and then also our colleagues around the country. And so we work almost like coaches sometimes to try to help the group keep the process moving. We like to support the leaders to help them keep motivated, troubleshoot problems, because we will work with the project for a couple of years, and then we'll step out, and hopefully the project is going to have feet of its own and fly. So that's what we like to do. We've found the enthusiasm of someone with a nascent project often says, oh, we're going to go and just get things done on the ground. And what we've tried to do, and that's the title of my project, was go slow to go fast. That to bring in all the players to collaborate well and get a good solid foundation under you. So to really say, okay, what's your purpose of the project? What's the purpose of the group? Who needs to be involved? How are we going to make decisions? And if there are disagreements, how are we going to resolve them so that down the road when humans work together, those things might arise. We actually have a framework for how to deal with it and not have everything collapse and everybody walks away frustrated and nothing happens. So then we say, okay, where is our focus and what are we producing? That was our work plan for this year, and we'll do one for this next year. If it could be that our work plan is 2 years, so that could be going fine. So, like I said, we tried to become part of the group, but we also, it's the near lens and then the far lens, that we're sitting at the table at each meeting, but we also try to kind of take the 10,000-foot view and say, okay, are things working smoothly? Do we have those foundations solidly in place so that we can handle any bumps that come along on the road? So that was us last summer. that we went and looked after we met for a day at Wellesley State Park. We then went out on the road and looked at where the road ecology work is hopeful to begin. There's also the trail component of the project, which we really haven't tackled too much. I think it's moving along nicely on its own, somewhat in the Canadian side, and actually David might be able to answer that better than I am. And so I actually have a few brochures if you're interested of what we do on the US side. I don't think there's an equivalent in Canada for our program. We get our marching orders from 3 different acts of Congress that allow us to work outside of national parks, which was the Organic Act, which started the Park Service, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and the National Trails Act, which said the Park Service could offer technical assistance to groups. So each of us takes on a handful of projects each year and try to roll up our sleeves and get stuff done with them. So it was a very quick and dirty presentation. So Julie Isbell is my colleague on this, and I'm Lelia Mellen.